Let me read to you part of what he said. At that time, you remember, we had freedom restored after the Marcos years. And he said, "But this freedom cannot be fully exercised unless there's order. Governments are instituted to ensure peace, stability, and continuity, to enable the citizens to plan their future and ensure the survival and growth of their children. The resumption of hostilities with the NPAs and the constant threat of rebellion in Mindanao and a very high incidence of crime are pointers of the lack of order I speak of," quoting Salas again. "Insecurity," he said, "stifles productivity. No long-term investment in high productivity can be encouraged when businessmen feel uncertain and insecure. The administration has exerted a sincere effort to resolve these problems, but time presses. Order must prevail. A free society cannot be mobilized for development unless there's a feeling of safety and confidence in the future." End of quote. The same speech would have been relevant post-EDSA II. How prophetic and unfortunate that things have not changed the past 20 years. But now let us begin by focusing on further questions I have and start with the discussion on education. We tend to unfairly blame every current administration for our problems. But can't we see that the steady decline of educational standards is the cumulative neglect of many administrations and the unwillingness to adopt long-term solutions to problems that cannot be solved by a ribbon-cutting event? The success or failure of any organization depends upon its policies and efforts on developing its human resources. For a nation to adopt short-term policies on education is national suicide. Doesn't the solution of peace and order problems depend upon relatively equal educational opportunities for the rich and poor, for the Christians and the Muslims? We as a nation are proud to have a university older than Harvard, proud that UP celebrates the success of 100 years. We're proud of Ateneo, La Salle, and many other Catholic universities where men and women of upper income groups are educated. We praise these institutions of learning, but as a nation, we seem to accept the scandalously high national dropout rates of students in basic education. The figures are worse in Muslim areas and in poor communities. In many towns and villages, Synergia, led by Nene Guevara, and working with mayors and community leaders who want change, has improved literacy rates, but much, much greater national efforts are needed. As the recipient of the largest of government education funds, shouldn't UP endeavor to enlist its many successful and wealthy alumni in a campaign to return to their alma mater the benefits they have received from the school, and thus enable more funds to be diverted from UP and allocated to basic education? Should the students from upper income groups not be asked to pay for the full cost of education? When upper income families send their children abroad, they do pay full tuition. Should they not be asked to do the same in their own country? Has UP studied how neighboring countries have dropped poverty levels? The Asian Development Bank just released a report last week pointing out that the Philippines and India, who claim to be democracies, lag behind East Asian nations in reducing poverty. China and Vietnam, both authoritarian states, are the two countries that have rapidly reduced poverty. Are there lessons that we can learn here? Why have Singapore and Thailand developed hospitals for medical tourism where we send our excellent doctors and nurses to developed countries? Should we not advocate some system where destination countries compensate us for training these professionals? Are inward remittances of poor overseas workers with divided families offsetting outward remittances of upper income Filipinos educated in subsidized schools like UP and setting up households abroad? You can, of course, tell me that the world is flat and that young people should be free to move anywhere. Yes, our young men and women should go abroad. It widens their horizon and gives them the skills to better serve their country. But we should strive to keep their hearts Filipino and with a resolve that they will return to serve in their country's development. And government policy should work with them to use its limited resources to reduce poverty and improve the lives of all citizens. Is UP doing its part to help government adopt long-term educational measures to ensure this? We all agree on the need of national unity. Can we point to the politics of fraternities as the root of the excessive time spent on national politics? Or is the lack of unity a basic disadvantage of an island nation? Is the sluggish pace of economic development the result of blind acceptance of Western thinking that political freedom of democracy comes ahead of economic freedom? Doesn't democracy assume that there must be the rule of law, which implies an independent judiciary with well-trained and well-paid honest lawyers? Where judges may be poorly paid and subject to political pressures, is it possible to have an independent judiciary, let alone a working democracy? I raise these questions again. UP has produced excellent lawyers and many of the bar top-notchers that are managing the large law firms. But are they leaders in reforming the judicial system? How close is UP to recognize that the Philippines is part of Asia and that China, India, and Japan will be exerting more influence on our future than the US and Europe? Is the faculty of UP School of Asian Studies deeply knowledgeable about the culture and the political thinking of our neighbors, and are they proficient in other Asian languages? Even Japan, very closely allied to the United States, does not have the government or economic structure of the Western world. The party in power has not changed for over 50 years, and its corporate structure and behavior are very different from Western firms. With the Toyota donation, you will at least have the fiscal structure for the School of Asian Studies. But the faculty is even more important than the building. Thus, our being the only Catholic country in Asia with an extremely conservative church leadership, seen only in Poland and Malta, hamper our capacity to understand our Asian neighbors. What is the role of UP as the only well-known Philippine university that is not Catholic? With a 6% Muslim population, minority, and our dependence on imported energy, does UP have a faculty that's knowledgeable in the history and culture of the Middle East and fluent in Arabic languages? To follow US policy, which would necessarily have to favor Israel, can only spell disaster for the Philippines. Has UP studied what measures should be taken to narrow the education gap between Christians and Muslims? And maybe I should narrate an incident that took place relative to the oil problem. When the State of Israel was being set up, General Romulo, as the Philippine ambassador to the UN, had made a speech against setting up Israel as a separate state because we have the 6% Muslim minority. President Truman put pressure on, I think, President Quirino at that time to vote for Israel. Romulo said, I cannot. I made the speech against it. He was asked to leave the UN. Ambassador Elizalde, Philippine ambassador to Washington, was made acting head of the Philippine delegation to the UN. He voted for the setting up of Israel. That won by one vote. It was the Philippine vote that changed history. When the oil crisis took place in 1973, the Philippines was declared to be an unfriendly country. And many of you are not old enough to remember those days when we had gasoline rationing. The Philippines went to the US and said, you put us into this trouble, can you now give us oil? The US said, we are also short of oil. Too bad. No? Fortunately, at that time, General Romulo was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. He was then sent by President Marcos to Saudi Arabia. Long lines of people, including David Rockefeller, I remember, were waiting to see the king. The king thought that Filipinos are bastards. They voted against us, but this guy Romulo is all right. They did see him, and in his very convincing way, he was able to eventually ask Saudi Arabia to exert their influence on OPEC and to remove Philippines from the category of, you might say, unfriendly countries. And then later on, we ended our rationing. But that shows you that when we forget our own national interests, we always get into trouble. You know? Now, my brief comments about the UP campus, which I see what an attractive place you have.